You're not the boss of me, is what we said as young children to our siblings or to peers who tried to tell us what to do. You're not the boss of me. As we grew older, we realized that, in fact, some people are our bosses. Or at least some people have a level of authority over our lives. Over time, we learn that ultimately we are accountable for our actions, accountable to those people in our lives who have authority, our parents first, and then our employers, and I guess teachers. And just as important, we're accountable to people who depend on us. We're accountable to our children, to our friends, to our religious community. A long list of people have claim to our lives. They're not our bosses, but they are ours, and we are theirs. The title of this sermon comes from a nationwide conversation that happened among UU ministers a few years ago. In meetings in various forums, we thought together through this question, whose are we? At one of those retreats, we got together discussing whose are we and generated all kinds of lofty theological and philosophical answers. They got more and more complex and a little bit competitive. Until one colleague, Matthew McCrary, who is married and has 5 young boys, said simply, "I belong to my family." It was a helpful and quick way to bring our heady discussion back to the ground. Indeed, he does belong to his family. The most immediate sense of who we belong to for most of us revolves around family. As children, we're beholden to our parents' authority over us. As we grow older, those relationships shift. While they no longer hold immediate authority over our lives, we're accountable to them. And when we have children of our own, our lives change, or so I have observed. We give over a part of who we are, and we're fundamentally responsible for or beholden to another human being. They are ours and we are theirs. My brother, who has 2 kids, one time described caring for his, I think she was probably 2, and was sick one night. He said, "It's like the greatest joy you can imagine and your greatest fear in the world all wrapped up in one tiny, vulnerable person." And I'm sure there's an ebb and flow of that intensity, but at the end of it all, they are your kids and you are their parent. We are theirs and they are ours. Family, of course, doesn't necessarily mean blood. It means people who we call our own, whether that's by choice or by marriage or by adoption or by birth. It doesn't really matter what the shape of the family. At the end of the day, we belong to our families. For a very long time, I answered this question of whose are we with an image of concentric circles. For most of our history, this was a pretty accurate depiction. At the center of those circles is the self and immediate family, and then a next circle wider might be friends or our work or our faith community, and then wider still might be our neighborhood and our town, and then our country, and then probably our planet. This week, as I was considering the question of whose are we, I realized that model of concentric circles is a little outdated. There was a time when one's family, neighborhood, faith community, social commitments all lined up as neat as Russian nesting dolls. Of course, the family went to the same church. It was even assumed that if you were part of a particular family, you would do a particular type of work or a particular tier of profession. All of those components of life were geographically centered in one spot that you would have some loyalty to. In our modern lives, every one of those neat little concentric circles has been exploded. My family, the people that I have the strongest claim to and that I hold in my heart, live over 1,000 miles away. And that's true for several of us. Many families are not of one faith tradition. We may be doing dramatically different types of work from our family and dissolving class boundaries. For work, you might telecommute to a company that lives 2 states over or 2 countries over. In many ways, that shift is a good thing. Those concentric circles of commitment from history sometimes limited our possibilities. That world was pretty small. Today, our commitments, though, are spread out in very different directions, sometimes creating competing claims for our time and energy. And the farther apart they get, as we try to respond to the needs of family over here and work over here and religious community over here and political life over here, we can lose a center of personal identity. So in this very modern challenge of competing commitments, I'm drawn toward a very old answer. For our Unitarian predecessors, and I'm thinking of William Ellery Channing in particular, our first and most important relationship was with God. For Channing, it was very clear that personal relationship with the sacred was the starting point out of which other relationships grew and found depth and meaning. The answer to whose are we was clear. Now, as Unitarian Universalists of today, we might broaden that idea to say that our first and primary relationship is with our sense of authenticity, our integrity, our sense of what's sacred, our sense of what is right and true. Those people who lay claim to our lives are great and loving influences. Well, most of them are, most of the time. If we're not careful, though, living for other people can lead into some pretty murky waters. Without some anchor for ourselves, through our faith or our core sense of self, there's not a whole lot left to go around for the rest. And this metaphor is ridiculously overused, but it holds true. You have to put your own oxygen mask on first before you can help the person next to you. And this is the last place I thought I would end up when I started writing this sermon. But today, for me, the answer to whose are we is first your highest values or the sacred or some other very personal anchor. By now, you've probably started mapping through the different people and communities that lay claim to your life, whether that's family or work or friends or maybe tapestry. I want to name a couple of other answers to those questions that may not have popped up on your map yet. The reading from earlier was a little bit jarring. I chose it for this service because it's a strong reminder of how marginalized some people are. It can be easy to forget that a whole lot of people live one day to the next, barely hanging on. Staying alive is a daily achievement. And as we consider who has a claim to our resources, our time, our attention, compassion calls us to acknowledge our neighbors in profound need. Just a few days ago, on Thursday, several Tapestry members gathered here for a first-time event for us. It was a memorial service for people in Orange County who had died without a home. We read the names of 19 people who had died in the last month, who the county coroner said were homeless. Included in those names was a date of their death and the city where they died. And after the service, a couple of people made a powerful observation. They said, it would have been really helpful to know the ages of these people. It got me thinking about life expectancy and homelessness, so I did a little tiny bit of research. It turns out that experiencing homelessness reduces a person's life expectancy 20 to 30 years. It's unlikely that those 19 names that we read Thursday evening lived into their 80s. And Reverend Raina's homily that evening, she offered us another eye-opening idea. She said if she were faced with the daily challenges of life on the street, that she would probably drink a lot too, and maybe even turn to escape the hardship in other ways. I can't say that I would do any differently. I can't say that my character is so strong that that kind of hardship wouldn't nudge me toward numbing myself by whatever means I could find. She also reminded us that one of the reasons life seems so different, their lives seem different from most of ours, is that we have an ability to hide our private lives. For people without homes, their entire life is on display. There's no hiding an addiction there. Meanwhile, plenty of Americans carry out their addiction in the quiet privacy of their own home. Our personal commitments are stretched in different directions. I know this. Sometimes we're spread very thin. We believe as people of faith that one answer to the question of whose are we is our neighbors in need. The last and maybe the most obvious answer to this question for today is we belong to the earth as well. It has made our lives possible, and we have some level of responsibility to pay the rent, as some say. While this is the most obvious source to which we owe some responsibility, it may be the most difficult source to pay back to. Belonging to the earth is a really daunting prospect. We know how to be supportive to our family and our friends, and there are 1,000 different spiritual practices or personal development practices to connect us to our core anchor. But paying our respect to the earth is more complicated. I can recycle, I can drive a hybrid car and eat organic. There are a lot of different things I can do. Still, it's hard to imagine a day in my life when I would be able to give more back to the natural world than I take from it. Throughout our lives, we've been trained to live in an unsustainable way. The habit of consuming resources has been embedded in us as what happy and successful lives look like. It's difficult to imagine a different way. Some movies help us explore that possibility. I'm reminded of the movie Avatar from several years ago. The plot is totally convoluted, but it really takes science fiction for us to imagine that dramatically different of a lifestyle. The movie depicts another planet where I guess an alien life form lives in genuine connection with their environment that sustains them, and they sustain it in return. And a whole genre of films explores the lives of Native Americans. Many of those films can contrast European American lifestyle with indigenous ways of understanding nature. And I'm not prepared to comment on the accuracy of those films. Some are brilliant and sensitive. Others are designed to sell tickets. It seems that those films, though, point to a yearning within us. As modern Americans, we hunger for a story of a different way of being in the world. Part of us knows that the modern American answer to the question, whose are we, isn't quite adequate. In our hearts, we know that we're accountable to one another, to our families, to our faith, to our earth. We know that the model of the rugged individual is unsustainable. So we long for a way of life where the only reasonable answer to the question, whose are we, includes more than our human neighbors. Some sermons are meant as a prophetic statement guiding to a particular answer, and some sermons are conversation starters. My goal today is the latter. In the coming days, I invite you to consider who has claim over your time and your energy. And amidst that pull in different directions, how do you maintain some grounded sense of self in all of that? Amen.